It started as a simple weekend getaway. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Appalachian woods. Just me, my girlfriend, Emily, and two of our closest friends, Jake and Lisa. It was supposed to be an escape from our busy lives, a chance to unwind, hike, and laugh around a fire. But I'll never forget the horrors we endured in that cursed place. The drive took longer than expected. By the time we arrived, the sun was sinking below the tree line, painting the forest in eerie shades of orange and purple. The cabin looked old, too old. The wood was splintered and gray, the windows fogged, and the porch creaked like it was whispering warnings. It wasn't the cozy retreat Emily had promised, but Jake shrugged it off. "Adds to the adventure, right?" he said with his usual cocky grin. The inside wasn't much better. The air was musty, heavy with an indefinable smell, something between rotting wood and damp earth. There were no lights apart from a dim lantern in the corner and an ancient fireplace. Still, we laughed it off, unpacked our bags, and settled in. That first night was uneventful, at least until around 3 a.m. I woke up to a soft scratching sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, coming from somewhere outside my bedroom window. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. Peeking through the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness. The forest was still, but the sound continued, like claws on wood. I told myself it was just a raccoon and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A series of deep, jagged scratches ran along the side of the cabin, right beneath my window. They were too large to be from any animal I knew. Jake laughed when I pointed them out. "Probably a bear. Let's just make sure we keep the food locked up." We spent the day hiking, but even then, I felt uneasy. The forest seemed too quiet. The birdsong and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. At one point, Lisa stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze. At first, there was nothing, but then came the faint sound of whispering. It was distant, unintelligible, but it chilled me to the bone. Jake brushed it off as the wind, but Lisa and I shared a worried glance. There was no breeze. That night, the cabin came alive. Around midnight, the sound started again, scratching, louder this time, moving along the walls as if something or someone was circling us. Emily clung to me, her face pale. Jake grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. "Stay here," he said. We begged him not to go, but Jake was stubborn. He stepped out into the cold, shining the light around the cabin. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. Then, just as he was about to turn back, the light caught something. A figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, bony arms that ended in claw-like hands. Its face was a pale blur, devoid of features, but its head tilted unnaturally as if it were listening. Jake froze, and so did we. Then the figure turned and vanished into the woods. Jake bolted inside, slamming the door. "There's something out there," he panted. His bravado was gone, replaced by sheer terror. The next few hours were chaos. The scratching grew louder, joined by pounding on the walls and windows. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find. The whispers returned, now inside the cabin, soft but undeniable. They came from the shadows, from the walls, from nowhere and everywhere. At one point, Emily screamed. She pointed to the corner, where the lantern flickered wildly. There, just for a moment, I saw it again. The figure, crouched like a spider, its head twisting toward us before it disappeared. We decided to leave. Grabbing our keys and abandoning our bags, we made a run for the car. The forest seemed alive, the trees pressing closer as if trying to trap us. The whispers followed us, growing louder, mocking us. When we reached the car, the doors wouldn't open. The locks clicked and clattered as if manipulated by unseen hands. Jake smashed a window with a rock, and we piled in, trembling and bleeding. The engine sputtered to life, and we tore down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and whatever haunted it behind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, we told the local sheriff what had happened. He listened, his face grave, then said something I'll never forget. "You're lucky to be alive. That cabin, it's cursed. People who stay there don't usually make it out." He wouldn't elaborate, but the haunted look in his eyes told us enough. We drove home the next morning, silent and hollow. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but it wasn't human. Even now, years later, I can't sleep without a light on. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear scratching at my window.
Story number 2.
I've never told anyone this story before. It's not because I don't want to talk about it, I just don't think anyone would believe me. But I lived it. Every second of it. and I'm still haunted by what happened in that cabin. It started with a family tradition. Every October, my cousin Nate and I would go camping in some remote area. This time, we decided to mix it up and rent an old hunting cabin deep in the Ozarks. The photos online made it look rustic but charming. Wooden beams, a fireplace, and a cozy loft. We thought it would be perfect. The first sign something was off happened when we stopped in the closest town for supplies. The cashier at the general store froze when Nate mentioned the cabin. "You sure you want to stay up there?" she asked, her voice low. "Why not?" Nate said, trying to play it cool. The cashier shook her head. "People around here avoid that place. Bad things happen. It's not right." Nate laughed it off as superstitious nonsense, but her words clung to me. Still, we shrugged it off and made the long drive into the woods. The cabin looked wrong. The photos hadn't captured its true state. The wood was warped and dark, and the windows seemed to stare back at us like empty eyes. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. But we'd paid for the weekend, so we unpacked and tried to settle in. Inside, the cabin felt colder than it should have. The old fireplace barely worked, and the shadows seemed deeper than normal. There was a strange smell, something sour, almost metallic, but we couldn't pinpoint its source. That first night, the wind howled around us. At least I thought it was wind until I heard the whispers. They were faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but they were there. Words I couldn't make out, coming from nowhere and everywhere. I didn't mention it to Nate, but I could tell by the way he kept glancing around that he'd heard them too. The next morning, we explored the woods. The trees seemed too close together, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal hands. We found strange things, a pile of animal bones arranged in a spiral, a tree carved with symbols neither of us recognized. I wanted to go back to the cabin, but Nate insisted on pressing on. That's when we found the well. It was ancient, made of crumbling stones and covered with moss. Something about it felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and the smell from the cabin was stronger here. Nate, being Nate, grabbed a rock and dropped it in. We waited for the splash. It never came. "No," I said, stepping back. "We're done here." That night was worse. Much worse. Around midnight, the whispers came back, louder this time. I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floorboards. I thought it was Nate until I looked over and saw him still asleep in his bed. I grabbed my flashlight and crept into the main room. The front door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I swear I'd locked it before we went to bed. I stepped outside, my breath clouding in the freezing air. That's when I saw the footprints. They were large, inhuman, with long, clawed toes. They started at the door and led back into the woods. I should have gone inside and barricaded the door. I should have woken Nate. But something compelled me to follow them. The tracks led me back to the well. My flashlight flickered and the air grew colder. The smell was overpowering now. I shone the light into the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Something pale and writhing deep inside. I ran back to the cabin and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, Nate was gone. His bed was empty, his boots missing. At first, I thought he'd gone for a walk, but his phone and jacket were still on the table. I shouted his name, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. I grabbed a hunting knife from the cabin and set out to find him. The woods seemed different, darker, more twisted. The trees loomed over me, and the ground felt spongy, like I was walking on something that wasn't dirt. I kept calling his name until my throat was raw. Finally, I found him, or what was left of him. He was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in a scream. Deep scratches ran down his arms, and his chest was hollowed out, like something had reached inside and taken everything. His blood soaked the ground, but the spirals I'd seen the day before were carved into the earth beneath him. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin, but when I did, I grabbed my keys and bolted. As I sped down the dirt road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. It was standing in the cabin doorway, watching me. It was tall and thin, its skin as pale as moonlight. Its head tilted, and its mouth opened in a grin that stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I pressed the gas pedal harder. I never went back. I told the police about Nate, but they didn't believe me. By the time they checked the cabin, it was empty. No blood, no body, no signs of struggle, just that awful smell. I've tried to forget, but the nightmares won't let me. Sometimes I wake up to whispers outside my window, and last night, for the first time, I saw footprints in the snow.
Story number 3.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Not until the night I stayed in that cabin. It started innocently enough, a work retreat in the Smoky Mountains. My boss rented a rustic cabin for the team, nestled deep in the woods. It was old but charming at first glance, with a wraparound porch and a view of a lake that glistened in the sunlight. There were 8 of us, and the plan was to bond over nature hikes and late-night s'mores. The first day was perfect. We hiked trails that twisted through the dense forest, shared stories over dinner, and laughed as the fire crackled in the hearth. That night, as we turned in, I noticed something strange. A worn leather book sitting on the mantel. Its cover was cracked and faded, the title too illegible to read. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, some of it shaky and frantic. The first entry was dated 1932. I hear them at night, scratching, whispering. They say it's in my head, but I know better. Something lives here. I chuckled nervously and shut the book. It was probably a prank, I thought, something left to scare gullible tourists like me. I left it on the mantel and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was someone walking in the hall. But as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was scratching. Faint but deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I sat up and turned on the lamp. My room was empty, the door locked. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal outside. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from under the bed. Heart pounding, I leaned over and peered beneath the frame. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but I saw something, movement. Something small and quick scuttled into the shadows before I could make it out. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others about the noise. Most of them laughed, teasing me about watching too many horror movies. But Claire, one of the quieter members of our team, frowned. I heard it too, she said. It was outside my window, like scratching. We brushed it off and went about our day, but there was a tension now, an unease that none of us could shake. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The air felt heavier, colder, and the forest outside seemed darker, almost oppressive. We gathered around the fire again, trying to ignore the growing dread. At some point, Claire picked up the leather book. "What is this?" she asked, flipping through the pages. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed. They come closer each night. I can hear them breathing now. They know I see them. I tried to leave, but the woods won't let me. Every path leads back here. They're in the house. God help me, they're in the house. The last entry was dated 1935. It simply read, "Don't look at them. Whatever you do, don't look at them." We sat in stunned silence. The fire sputtered, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. "It's just a joke," Jake said finally, forcing a laugh. Someone probably left it here to mess with people, but none of us really believed that. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just under my bed now. It was in the walls, in the ceiling, everywhere. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound crawled into my head like a swarm of insects. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I let out a shaky breath and opened my eyes. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of my room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its face, I can't describe its face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It stared at me, unmoving, its black eyes boring into mine. I froze, paralyzed by fear. I remembered the last line in the book, "Don't look at them." But it was too late. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Then it leaned in, its face inches from mine, its lips, or whatever passed for lips, parted. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a low rasp that echoed in my skull. I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the room was empty. I convinced myself it was a nightmare, a product of exhaustion and overactive imagination. But when I joined the others in the kitchen, I knew I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. Claire was pale, her hands trembling as she sipped her coffee. Jake had dark circles under his eyes, and his usual bravado was gone. "We need to leave," Claire said. "Now." No one argued. We packed up in record time and piled into the cars. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching us. We didn't talk much on the drive home, but later I tried looking up the cabin online. It wasn't listed anymore. In fact, I couldn't find any record of it existing at all. Since that night, I haven't gone back to the woods. I haven't stayed in another cabin either. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone at night, I hear faint scratching, and I know deep down that they're still watching.
Story number 4.
They say the forest hides secrets. I never believed it until I found myself in that cabin. It was supposed to be a getaway, just me and my boyfriend, Adam. Life in the city had become too chaotic, and the idea of escaping to a remote cabin sounded perfect. Adam found one listed online, a quaint place nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but we didn't question it. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, lined with ancient trees that seemed to press closer with each passing mile. By the time we arrived, dusk was settling over the forest, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. The cabin was smaller than I expected, its wooden exterior weathered and gray. It had an air of abandonment, but Adam brushed it off, saying, "It's part of the charm." I forced a smile, though the unease in my gut told me otherwise. Inside, it was no better. The air was thick and stale, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A dusty painting of a family, parents and 2 children, hung above the fireplace. Their faces were stern, unsmiling, and their eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. "It's fine," Adam said, unpacking our bags. "Let's just make the best of it." We spent the evening trying to settle in. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Adam's laughter filled the room as we played cards and shared stories. For a moment, I started to relax. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the sounds began. It was faint at first, a distant tapping, like someone knocking on the wooden walls from outside. "Probably an animal," Adam said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It moved along the walls, circling the cabin. My heart raced as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Adam grabbed a flashlight and opened it. "Stay here," he whispered. "Are you insane?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. But he was already outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. I stood frozen, listening as his footsteps crunched on the gravel. Then came the scream. It wasn't Adam's. It was something else. High-pitched, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. Adam stumbled back inside, slamming the door. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "There's something out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, the tapping never ceasing. Sleep was impossible, and by morning we decided we couldn't stay another night. But when we stepped outside, the forest was wrong. The trees, once tall and inviting, now loomed like skeletal sentinels. The path we'd driven up had vanished, replaced by dense undergrowth. Adam swore under his breath. "No way. We came this way." We tried to walk back the way we'd come, but every path seemed to loop back to the cabin. The sun was high overhead, yet the forest was unnaturally dark, the air heavy with the scent of decay. It was Adam who found the carvings first. Symbols etched into the trees, strange and angular, unlike anything I'd seen before. Beneath one was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Against my better judgment, Adam picked it up and unwrapped it. Inside was a crude doll made of sticks and twine, its head a bundle of dried grass. Its eyes were 2 black stones, and its mouth was a slit carved into the bark. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. Adam nodded, dropping the doll, but as it hit the ground, the air around us seemed to change. The forest grew silent, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. And then we heard it, a voice. It was faint, almost childlike, calling from deeper in the woods. "Help me." Adam froze. "Did you hear that? Don't," I begged, grabbing his arm. "It's not real." But he was already moving toward the sound. "Adam, no!" I screamed, but he didn't stop. I ran after him, the voice growing louder. It was everywhere, echoing through the trees. "Help me, please." I found Adam standing in a small clearing, staring at something on the ground. When I reached him, I saw what had stopped him, another doll, identical to the first. But this one had something else. Beneath it, carved into the dirt, was Adam's name. We both stared at it, neither of us daring to speak. Then the voice changed. "Adam," it whispered. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. "We're leaving. Now." We sprinted back to the cabin, though it felt like the forest was closing in around us. When we reached the door, it was already open. Inside, the fire had gone out, and the air was freezing, and the painting above the fireplace, the family was gone. "What the hell?" Adam began, but I cut him off. "We're leaving. I don't care how. We're leaving." We grabbed what little we could and bolted outside, determined to find the road. The forest seemed to twist and shift around us, every path leading nowhere. Hours passed, the sun dipping below the horizon, and panic set in. Then we saw it, the well. It stood in the middle of a clearing, ancient and crumbling. The same symbols carved into the trees were etched into its stones. Adam moved toward it, as if in a trance. "Don't," I begged, pulling him back. But it was too late. He leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. "It's calling me," he said, his voice distant. "Adam, no!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. But something grabbed him first. A hand, pale and gnarled, shot out of the well, wrapping around his wrist. He screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. I grabbed him, digging my heels into the dirt, but the hand was relentless, dragging him closer. More hands emerged, clawing at his legs, his chest. "Run!" he shouted, his voice breaking. I didn't want to leave him. I tried to hold on, but he was ripped from my grasp, pulled into the darkness of the well. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back, but I did. When I reached the cabin, I grabbed the car keys and drove, not stopping until I hit the nearest town. The police didn't believe me. They found the cabin, but no trace of Adam or the well. I've told myself 100 times that it wasn't real, that it was some horrible nightmare. But I still hear the voice, every night, just outside my window. "Help me!"
Story number 5.
I don't know why I agreed to watch that cabin. Maybe it was the money. $200 a day to stay there for a week seemed too good to pass up. The owner, Mr. Garvey, was an old man who said he'd inherited the place but hadn't been able to keep up with it. He needed someone to stay there, keep an eye on it, and make sure the local kids didn't cause trouble. From the moment I pulled up, I had second thoughts. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and surrounded by towering pines that seemed to block out the sun. The structure itself was run down, with peeling paint and moss growing on the roof. The air was still, heavy, and smelled faintly of rot. Inside wasn't much better. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the walls were lined with faded photos of grim-faced people I assumed were Garvey's relatives. A large, antique mirror hung in the main room, its ornate frame carved with strange, twisting shapes that made me uneasy if I stared at them too long. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored the cabin, made a fire, and settled into an armchair with a book. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the rustle of leaves outside. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft tapping sound coming from the main room. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch tapping against the window. But when I went to check, the windows were clear. The tapping was coming from the mirror. I stood there, staring at it, my reflection barely visible in the dim light. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it, a shadow moving behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called Mr. Garvey. "Has anyone ever mentioned strange things happening here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean by strange?" he replied, his tone cautious. I hesitated, then told him about the tapping and the shadow. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Don't look in the mirror," he said finally. His voice was flat, emotionless. "No matter what you hear or see, don't look at it. Do you understand?" Before I could ask what he meant, he hung up. That night, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, staying in my room with the door closed, but it was impossible. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was scratching, like nails dragging across the glass. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door, clutching a flashlight, and stepped into the main room. The mirror was different. The glass looked darker, almost like it was filled with smoke. And in the center, I saw something, an outline of a figure, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. It moved. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. The figure pressed its hand against the inside of the glass, its fingers long and bony. Then it smiled. Its teeth were too many, too sharp, and too white. I ran back to my room and locked the door. For the rest of the night, I heard it. Scratching, tapping, and, worst of all, whispering. Faint, unintelligible words that seemed to come from all around me. By morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the money or what Mr. Garvey would think. I just wanted out. I packed my bag and headed for the door. But the forest was different. The road I'd driven in on was gone, replaced by dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My phone had no signal, and the air felt wrong. Too thick, too still. I turned back to the cabin, my chest tightening. The door was wide open, though I knew I'd closed it behind me. Inside, the mirror was gone. In its place was a dark void, a hole in the wall that seemed to suck in the light. Whispers echoed from within, louder now, more insistent. I stepped closer, my body moving against my will, as if something was pulling me toward it. "Don't look," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see Mr. Garvey standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You have to leave. Now." "I've been trying," I shouted, my voice trembling. "There's no way out." He shook his head. "There's always a way out, but you can't look. No matter what you hear, no matter what it shows you, don't look. Don't look." Before I could ask him what he meant, the whispers grew louder. The room darkened, and the void began to ripple, shapes forming within it. It showed me my mother, standing in the woods outside the cabin. She looked lost, confused, calling my name. "Don't," Garvey said, stepping in front of me. "It's not real. It's never real." But then it showed me Adam, my younger brother, who had died in a car accident years ago. He stood in the void, smiling at me, tears streaming down his face. "Help me," he said, his voice breaking. "Please." I moved toward him, but Garvey grabbed my arm. "It's lying," he shouted. "That thing will use anything it can to pull you in. Don't let it." I froze, torn between the desperate need to reach my brother and the fear coursing through me. Then, the whispers turned to screams, agonized, ear-splitting wails that filled the room. The void began to close, its edges folding inward, and the shapes within it writhed and twisted. "Now!" Garvey yelled, pulling me toward the door. We ran, the cabin shaking behind us. Somehow the forest opened up, the road appearing before us like it had never been gone. We didn't stop until we reached my car. Garvey refused to tell me more. He simply said, "Don't come back," and walked into the forest. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. Sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping on my windows, faint and rhythmic, and when I dream, I see the mirror. It's always there waiting for me with something moving just beneath the surface.
Story number 6.
I was always drawn to the idea of living off the grid, away from the noise and chaos of the city. When I found the listing for the isolated cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it seemed perfect. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, with a wood stove, a well for water, and acres of untouched forest. The owner, a wiry old man named Elijah, seemed eager to rent it out, almost too eager. "The place has its quirks," he said, not meeting my eyes as he handed me the keys. "What kind of quirks?" I asked, curious but unfazed. He hesitated, then muttered, "Just don't go outside after dark." I laughed, thinking it was some old mountain superstition, but his expression stayed grim. "I mean it," he said, gripping my arm. His bony fingers were ice cold. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." I chalked it up to an old man's paranoia. I'd driven hours to get here and wasn't about to let some cryptic warning ruin my plans. The first day was uneventful. I settled in, chopped some wood for the stove, and explored the surrounding forest. The air was crisp, the silence soothing. It was exactly what I'd been craving. That night, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the cabin took on a different feel. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the silence became oppressive. I reminded myself that isolation was the point, even if it was unnerving. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It came from the back of the cabin, near the small kitchen window. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird, but the sound was too deliberate. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it out the window. Nothing but darkness stared back at me. Still, the unease lingered, and I double-checked that the doors were locked before heading to bed. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the kitchen window. They weren't animal tracks, but human, barefoot, and too large to be mine. The thought of someone walking around in the freezing cold, barefoot, made my stomach churn. I decided not to dwell on it. Maybe some local had wandered by, though why they'd knock and then leave without a word was beyond me. The second night, the knocking started again, this time at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No reply. I peeked through the curtain, but no one was there. The porch was empty, the forest beyond eerily still. When I turned away, I noticed something chilling. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was coming from the back window now. Knock, knock, knock. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Whatever it was moving. I wanted to believe it was a prank, maybe kids messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room with a fire roaring in the stove, every light in the cabin on. By the third day, the isolation no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a trap. I called Elijah. "Is there someone living near here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone who might be visiting?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Leave," he said finally. "What?" "Pack your things and leave. I shouldn't have rented it to you." His words sent a chill through me. "What's going on? Who's knocking on the cabin?" "It's not a who," he said quietly. Before I could ask what he meant, the line went dead. That night, the knocking started earlier, like just after sunset. It came from all sides of the cabin now, moving erratically. First the front door, then the bedroom window, then the roof. Knock, knock, knock. I shouted into the darkness, begging whoever it was to leave me alone, but the knocking only grew louder, more insistent. At some point, I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, curled up in the corner of the living room. When I woke up, the cabin was silent again. But there was something new. On the floor, near the front door, was a pile of dirt. Sticking out of the dirt was an object that made my blood run cold. A human tooth. I packed my things and tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I turned the key. It wasn't until I popped the hood that I saw why. The wires had been chewed through, the marks jagged and uneven. Desperate, I started walking, following the dirt road that led to the cabin. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on either side. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and decay, and then I heard it, the knocking. Not on the cabin this time, but on the trees around me. Knock, knock, knock. I broke into a run, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The knocking followed, growing louder and faster. I tripped and fell, landing hard on the dirt road. When I looked up, my flashlight illuminated a figure standing ahead of me. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were sunken, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. It raised one long bony hand and knocked on a tree. Knock, knock, knock. I scrambled to my feet and ran in the opposite direction, back toward the cabin. When I reached it, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving. The knocking started again, louder than ever. It came from every wall, every window, surrounding me. Knock, knock, knock. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually it stopped. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. I didn't waste any time. I packed what I could carry and started walking down the road again, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. When I told the clerk about the cabin, he gave me a strange look. "There hasn't been a cabin up there in years," he said. I insisted, but he shook his head. "That land's been abandoned since the fire, burned down in the 80s, killed a whole family." I didn't argue, I just paid for a ride to the nearest town and never looked back. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes. Knock, knock, knock.
Story number 7.
I never intended to visit the old mining town of Black Hollow. It was one of those places that existed more in whispers and rumors than on any map. But when my best friend Liam dared me to join him on a photography trip to document abandoned places, I couldn't say no. The trip was supposed to be a quick in and out, take some photos, explore a bit, and leave before dark. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dilapidated wooden buildings. Black Hollow looked like a ghost town ripped straight from a nightmare. Boarded up windows, sagging roofs, and streets overgrown with weeds. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. "This place is perfect," Liam said, grinning as he adjusted his camera. "Creepy as hell." I wasn't as thrilled. Something about the place felt wrong, like the town itself was watching us. But I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I shrugged it off. We started with the main street, snapping photos of the crumbling saloon and the abandoned general store. The air felt heavier the farther we walked, the silence growing thicker. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the window of the hotel, a flicker of shadow, but when I turned, there was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," I muttered to myself. By the time we reached the edge of town, the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. That's when we found the mine. The entrance yawned open like a black hole, framed by rotting wooden beams. A rusty sign hung lopsided above it, the words "Black Hollow Mine," barely legible. Liam's eyes lit up. "This is where the real gold is," he said, pulling out his flashlight. "Come on." I hesitated. The mine felt alive. The air around it seemed colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that stepping inside would be a mistake. But Liam was already disappearing into the darkness, so I had no choice but to follow. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels, the walls slick with moisture and the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Our footsteps echoed, the sounds swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. Liam snapped photos as we went, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This is amazing," he whispered, as though speaking too loudly would disturb something. I didn't respond. My unease had grown into full-blown dread. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd hear faint sounds, whispers, the scrape of something on stone, but every time I stopped to listen, there was nothing. We reached a large chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into the darkness. In the center of the room was an old wooden cart filled with rocks and debris. Liam moved closer to take a photo, but I stayed by the tunnel entrance, my flashlight darting nervously around the space. That's when I saw it. At the far edge of the chamber, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something moved. It was a shape, humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, its head tilted as if it was watching us. "Liam," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to go." He didn't hear me. He was too focused on his camera, adjusting the angle for the perfect shot. The creature stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Liam!" I hissed, louder this time. "What?" he said, finally looking up. But by then the thing was gone, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. "There's something in here," I said, grabbing his arm. "We have to leave, now." He frowned, but didn't argue, sensing the panic in my voice. We started back the way we came, our pace quickening with every step. But the mine had changed. The tunnels seemed narrower, the air heavier, and no matter how far we walked, we didn't reach the entrance. "Are we lost?" Liam asked, his voice tight with fear. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We just need to keep going." The whispers started again, louder now, echoing around us. They weren't in English or any language I recognized. Just a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The light from our flashlights flickered, casting the walls in shifting, menacing shadows. And then we heard it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the stone. It was coming from behind us. "Run," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and the whispers turned to guttural growls. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them, closing in. We turned a corner, and suddenly there was light. The exit. I didn't question it. I just ran toward it, Liam right behind me. We burst out into the cool night air, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was silent. The mine loomed behind us, its entrance dark and foreboding. I half expected something to emerge, but nothing did. "We need to go," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." Liam nodded, and we stumbled back toward town. But as we passed the buildings, I realized something was wrong. The streets were different, cleaner, the buildings no longer crumbling. Lights glowed faintly in the windows, and faint laughter echoed from the saloon. "Is this—" Liam started, but he didn't finish the sentence. A figure stepped out of the hotel. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and gaunt. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Welcome back," he said, his voice hollow. I turned to run, but the road we'd taken into town was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of dark forest. The laughter grew louder, joined by whispers and the faint sound of knocking. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their faces twisted and unnatural. We were trapped. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. Running through the streets, doors slamming behind us, the feeling of cold hands grabbing at me. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside the town, the sun rising over the mountains. Liam was gone. I searched for him for days, but there was no sign of him, no trace of Black Hollow. When I finally made it back to civilization, I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. Sometimes at night, I hear the whispers, and when I close my eyes, I see the entrance to the mine, yawning open, waiting.
Story number 8.
The last time I saw my sister Evelyn was 5 years ago. She vanished without a trace during a camping trip in a remote forest near our hometown. Despite weeks of search parties and endless investigations, nothing was ever found. No body, no clues. Just gone. I hadn't stepped foot in those woods since, until now. When the email arrived, my heart stopped. It was from Evelyn, or at least someone pretending to be her. The subject line read, "I'm here. Come find me." Attached was a single GPS coordinate pointing directly to the forest where she disappeared. Logic told me it was a cruel joke, but my heart refused to believe it. What if it was her? What if she was alive, waiting for me? And against my better judgment, I packed a bag and set out the next morning. The forest was just as I remembered it. Towering pines, dense underbrush, and a heavy silence that seemed to press down on you like a weight. The air felt colder, the shadows darker. As I followed the GPS deeper into the woods, the familiar unease crept over me. It felt like the trees were watching. By the time I reached the coordinates, the sun was setting, casting the forest in a deep orange glow. The location was an overgrown clearing I didn't recognize, dominated by a single ancient oak tree. Beneath its gnarled branches was something that made my stomach churn. A circle of rocks, blackened by fire with strange symbols etched into the dirt around it. It wasn't there 5 years ago. I was sure of that. "Evelyn?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The forest swallowed the sound. I walked closer to the fire pit, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. Something shiny caught my eye, half buried in the dirt. I crouched down and pulled it free. A bracelet. Her bracelet, the one she was wearing the day she vanished. I clutched it to my chest, tears stinging my eyes. It had to be her. She was alive. That's when I heard it. A faint voice, carried on the wind. It was unmistakable. "Help me." My blood turned to ice. It was Evelyn's voice, distant but clear. It came from deeper in the woods, beyond the clearing. "Evelyn," I shouted, spinning around. "Where are you? Help me." The voice was fainter now, almost pleading. I ran toward it, crashing through the underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees impossibly dense. The voice grew louder, pulling me forward like a magnet. And then I saw her. She was standing in another clearing, her back to me. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and dirty, but it was her. It was Evelyn. I called out her name, relief flooding me. She didn't move. "Evelyn?" I said, stepping closer. "It's me. She turned. I stopped cold. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and stretched thin over her bones. She looked like Evelyn, but wrong, as if something else was wearing her face like a mask. Her mouth twisted into a grin that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. "You found me," she said, her voice hollow, echoing unnaturally. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The flashlight slipped from my hand, the beam swinging wildly as it hit the ground. When I looked up, she was gone. The forest was silent again. Too silent. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and spun around, searching for any sign of her, but the clearing was empty. "Evelyn," I shouted. My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the trees. And then the whispers began. They came from all directions, soft and indistinct, like dozens of voices speaking at once. The air grew colder, the shadows around me shifting unnaturally. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Words began to form, though they didn't make sense. "Stay. Join. Home." Something moved in the corner of my eye. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching a figure darting between the trees. Another figure followed, and another. They were too fast, too shadowy to make out, but they were there, watching, surrounding me. I ran. Branches tore at my skin, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of noise. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but all I could think about was getting out. Somehow, I burst into the clearing with the oak tree. The fire pit glowed faintly now, embers crackling despite no visible flame. The symbols etched into the ground seemed to pulse, almost alive. And standing beneath the tree was Evelyn. "Don't go," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. She looked more like herself now, her face cleaner, her eyes wide and innocent. "Please, stay with me." I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my heart holding me in place. It looked like her, sounded like her. Could it really be her? "You're not real," I whispered, my voice cracking. Her face twisted, sadness turning to anger. Her eyes darkened, her mouth stretching into an inhuman grin. "You can't leave," she said, her voice deeper now, layered with something guttural. "You're part of this." The fire pit erupted, flames shooting skyward, casting the clearing in an eerie orange light. Figures stepped out of the shadows, tall, thin, and wrong, their faces obscured but their presence undeniable. They surrounded me, their movements jerky, their whispers filling my head. I screamed, dropping the flashlight and covering my ears. The whispers grew louder, unbearable, drowning out my thoughts. "Run," a voice said, cutting through the noise. It wasn't Evelyn's voice. It was my own. Somehow I found my legs and ran. blindly tearing through the forest. The whispers followed, the figures darting in and out of my vision. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road where my car was parked. I didn't look back. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and sped away, not caring about the branches scraping the sides or the dirt kicking up behind me. When I reached the edge of the forest, the whispers finally stopped. The air felt lighter, the world brighter, but the relief was short-lived. As I drove home, Evelyn's voice echoed in my head, soft and pleading. "You found me. Don't leave me. I haven't gone back to the forest. I never will." But sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice again. And when I look out the window, I see her standing at the edge of the woods, waiting.
Story number 9.
When I first bought the farmhouse, everyone told me it was a mistake. "That place is cursed," the locals said, shaking their heads. The property had been abandoned for decades, the previous owners disappearing under mysterious circumstances. But the price was unbeatable, and I had always wanted to escape the chaos of the city. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. It had an unsettling charm, but I figured a little work would make it feel like home. What I didn't expect was the chilling strangeness that began almost immediately. The first night was uneventful, quiet, even peaceful. It wasn't until the second night that things started to go wrong. I was lying in bed, the wind howling outside, when I heard it, faint footsteps coming from the hallway. I froze. The house was locked, and I lived alone. Grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, I crept toward the door. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside my room. My heart pounded as I flung the door open. There was no one there. I searched the entire house, every room, every corner. Nothing. Telling myself it was just the old house settling, I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. Over the next few days, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence. They always came at the same time, just after midnight, pacing back and forth in the hallway. I tried to ignore them, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding my attention. One night, I decided I'd had enough. Armed with a camera, I set up to record the hallway. If there was an intruder, I wanted proof. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my blood ran cold. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps were unmistakable, echoing clearly on the recording. And then at 3:12 a.m., the camera began to shake violently, as if someone or something had grabbed it. The screen filled with static, and the recording cut out. I should have left then, packed my bags, and never looked back. But curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, kept me there. Things escalated quickly after that. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved inexplicably, and the house grew colder, no matter how high I turned up the heat. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, vanishing the moment I turned to look. One night I heard a voice. It was faint at first, a whisper carried on the wind. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, clearer. "Get out." It wasn't a suggestion. Terrified but determined, I decided to do some research on the house. I visited the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. What I found made my skin crawl. The farmhouse had belonged to the Harper family in the early 1900s. They were reclusive, rarely seen in town. In 1918, the entire family, parents and 3 children, vanished without a trace. Neighbors reported strange occurrences, lights flickering in the windows, strange noises at night, and an oppressive sense of dread. The house was sold several times over the years, but no one stayed long. There were whispers of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and madness. I returned home, my mind racing. I wanted to leave, but something compelled me to stay. It was as if the house wouldn't let me go. That night, I woke to the sound of laughter. Children's laughter, high-pitched and echoing. It came from downstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated at the top of the stairs. The laughter turned to crying, soft, mournful sobs. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The crying stopped, and then from the darkness below, a voice whispered, "Help us." My flashlight flickered and the temperature dropped sharply. I forced myself down the stairs, my hands shaking. The living room was empty, but the sobbing started again, coming from the basement. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something pulled me forward, like an invisible hand guiding me. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and mildew. My flashlight's beam landed on an old wooden chest in the corner. The sobbing seemed to come from inside it. I approached the chest, my breath visible in the frigid air. Slowly I lifted the lid. Inside were small, dusty toys, a doll with one missing eye, a wooden train, a stuffed bear, and then at the bottom I found it, a photograph. It was black and white, faded with age. The Harper family stared back at me, their expressions solemn, but it was the background that made my stomach turn. They were standing in the very hallway of my house, and behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, tall, thin, with unnaturally long limbs and hollow eyes. I dropped the photo and stumbled back, the flashlight falling from my hands. The room plunged into darkness, and the basement door slammed shut above me. Panic set in as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I turned it back on, the beam illuminated the figure from the photo. It stood at the far end of the basement, its head tilted unnaturally, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It started to move. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the basement, but I found myself outside, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and foreboding. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I left everything behind, the house, my belongings, even my sanity. It's been months, but I still wake up to the sound of footsteps, faint and distant as if they've followed me. And sometimes in the corner of my eye I see a shadow, a tall, thin figure, always watching. I'll never go back to that house, but I know deep down that it's not done with me.
Story number 10.
The old motel on Route 17 had been abandoned for years. Locals called it the Hollow Stay, a crumbling relic of the 1960s that sat on the outskirts of a long-forgotten highway. Rumors swirled about what had happened there. Some said the owners had vanished overnight. Others whispered about guests disappearing into thin air. Whatever the truth, no one stayed there anymore, except for me. I was on a solo road trip, trying to clear my head after a messy breakup. A bad storm hit just as I passed through a desolate stretch of road and my car broke down. My phone had no signal, and night was falling fast. That's when I saw the motel, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the rain. Vacancy, it read, though half the letters were burned out. With no other options, I grabbed my bag and ran toward the building. The wind howled as I pushed open the door to the lobby. It smelled like mildew and something faintly metallic. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face pale and gaunt. He looked up at me with tired eyes that seemed too dark, like deep wells of ink. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yes, just for the night," I replied, shivering. He slid a key across the counter without asking for payment. "Room 5, he said. I hesitated. "Don't you need my information?" His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No need." I took the key and hurried to my room, trying to ignore the unsettling vibe of the place. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling, and the air heavy with dampness. Room 5 was at the end of the hall. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was basic, a bed, a nightstand, and a small TV. But something about it felt off. The air was too still, the silence oppressive. I locked the door and sat on the bed, my wet clothes sticking to my skin. As I rummaged through my bag for dry clothes, I noticed something odd. The TV, though unplugged, turned on. Static filled the screen, hissing loudly. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Slowly, an image began to form, a dimly lit hallway, the same one I had just walked down. The camera seemed to move, as if someone was holding it, walking toward room 5, toward me. The TV flickered and went black. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I tugged and pulled, but the door remained stubbornly locked. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tap on the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I backed away, my heart racing. "Let me in," a voice whispered from the other side. It was soft, almost melodic, but wrong, like it didn't belong to a human throat. I pressed myself against the far wall, trembling. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of scratching, like nails dragging down the wood. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs as the scratching turned to pounding. And then, silence. I stood frozen, my ears straining to hear any sound. Minutes passed. Cautiously, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Relief flooded me as I reached for the lock. But before I could turn it, something moved on the other side. A face appeared, pressed against the peephole. A pale, hollow-eyed face with a grin that stretched too wide. "Found you," it whispered. I screamed, stumbling backward. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight barely cutting through the black. The face was gone, but the door began to shake violently, as if someone or something was trying to break it down. I retreated to the corner of the room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The pounding grew louder, the wood splintering. and then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for whatever came next. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I should have stayed put, but something compelled me to move, to step into the hall. It was different now. Longer, darker, with doors that seemed to stretch impossibly high. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. As I walked, the hallway seemed to shift, the walls bending and twisting. The doors were all slightly ajar, and from each came faint whispers, too low to understand. At the end of the hall was a single door, its frame glowing faintly. I didn't want to go through it, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me forward. The door swung open as I approached, revealing a room identical to mine. But on the bed sat a figure. It was me, or something that looked like me. Its head tilted as it smiled, a grin that stretched far too wide. "Welcome back," it said, its voice my own, but warped, distorted. I stumbled backward, the hallway stretching endlessly behind me. The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You'll stay this time," it said, stepping closer. "They all do." I turned and ran, the hallway twisting and turning, the doors slamming shut as I passed. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. I didn't stop until I burst into the lobby. The old man was gone, the desk empty. The neon sign outside flickered wildly. I ran into the storm, the rain soaking me as I fled down the highway. I didn't stop until I found a passing truck that took me to the nearest town. When I told the locals what had happened, they looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "There hasn't been a motel on Route 17 for 30 years, one of them said. "Burned down in the 70s. They say the guests never left." I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The knocking, the whispers, and the voice that sounds like mine. Welcome back.